You had 2 years. What did you build?
Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Vivian. Everything. No one in this city will take your calls when I'm done. Is that what you think right now? I made this family. I can unmake you. In the boardroom, tomorrow morning.
Say it, Mother. On record.
This is a private family matter.
Say it.
The match was strategically arranged. Thank you.
You came back after 2 years, and this is what you want. Fine. Sign them. I'll have my attorney file by Thursday. Vivian Ashworth left the Caldwell marriage 2 years ago with a single piece of evidence she told no one about and a plan she has been quietly building ever since. She has come back to Manhattan for 2 reasons: to collect a co-signatory release on a property trust she needs for a pending transaction, and to finalize the end of something that had already, in every way that mattered, ended years before. What Ethan Caldwell doesn't know, what almost no one in his world knows, is that the anonymous investor his board has been desperately courting to survive. A hostile takeover is the same woman he is about to hand divorce papers to. She wasn't in New York looking for a second chance. She was in New York because the final chapter of the longest game she has ever played was finally ready to close. The storm he thought was ending had not yet begun. The morning Vivian Ashworth came back to the Caldwell house, the city was doing what it does in early November, holding its breath between autumn and cold, refusing to commit to either. The light flat and particular above Fifth Avenue in a way that didn't flatter anything and didn't try to. She had called ahead, not because she needed permission to enter a building that still bore her name on 3 financial documents, but because Vivian did not arrive anywhere unannounced. That was a habit so thoroughly installed over 8 years of being a Caldwell wife that it no longer felt like restraint. It felt like architecture. You called ahead. You gave the shape of your arrival before you filled it. You arrived on time. She arrived 4 minutes early, which, if you understood her, was the same as arriving on time with a message already sent. The housekeeper, Mrs. Patton, opened the front door. The woman's face did the thing faces do when they are managing something personal. A flicker, quickly smoothed, replaced by the professional warmth of a woman who had kept this family's confidences for 19 years without once being asked to account for them. Miss Ashworth, she said, and the small self-correction settled in the air between them. Light as paper, precise as a pen. Good morning, Mrs. Patton. Vivian stepped inside and let her eyes adjust to the interior light. The same chandelier, the same Flemish oil painting on the landing wall, the dark one, with the woman in red holding something that had always looked, to Vivian, less like a gift and more like evidence. The same smell of old money and fresh flowers that had been the first thing she noticed when she moved in and the last thing she registered the morning she left. Not with longing, just recognition. The way you recognize a place in a dream, correctly, without weight. She was wearing a charcoal wool coat over a dark navy dress, her hair pulled back at the nape of her neck in the clean, undecorative style she had returned to after 2 years of being nobody's wife. She had not worn the coat he bought her. She had considered it briefly, in front of the mirror, that morning, and then decided that arriving in anything he had given her would be a statement she hadn't come here to make, in either direction. She carried a single leather folio. Inside it, the co-signatory release for the Whitmore Trust, a pending transaction that required the signature of both parties on the original 2021 filing, and 8 supporting pages that established, without ambiguity, that she knew exactly what she was signing and precisely why. She did not carry anything that looked like hope. She had packed that separately, 2 years ago, and left it in a place she could no longer quite locate. Mrs. Patton led her toward the study. Vivian already knew the way. Ethan Caldwell was on the phone when she appeared in the doorway. His back was to her, shouldered with the particular forward tension of a man who has been managing something since before most people's alarms went off. Standing at the window that looked down over the back garden, bare in November, the topiary trimmed to the winter shapes his mother had mandated, as long as anyone in this house could remember. Dark suit, jacket off, shirt sleeves pushed to the elbow. His voice, low and controlled, carried the specific register of someone handling a problem that had spent the night refusing to resolve. Tell Keswick to hold the Reeve response until I've reviewed the language myself, he said. I don't want a single number in that filing I haven't personally approved. A pause. I don't care how long it takes. Do it right. He turned as he ended the call. For 1 second. Specific kind of second that only exists between two people with that much history. In a room with that much silence. Neither of them said anything at all. He looked at her the way you look at something you were certain you had filed away correctly and have just found sitting in front of you, entirely real, requiring a response. She gave him the time to find one. Vivian, he said. His voice had achieved neutral with impressive speed. She gave him credit for that. Ethan. She stepped into the room without waiting to be invited. She had not needed an invitation to walk into this study for 8 years, and she was not going to acquire the habit of needing one today. She placed the folio on the edge of his desk and opened it to the release form. I need signatures on pages 3, 7, and 12. The notarization block on 12 requires initials on both lines. He looked at the document, then at her. She could see the things she had cataloged during 8 years of marriage as his management process. The rapid sorting of available information into categories. The search for the angle that made the situation legible. She had watched him run that process in board meetings and at charity dinners, and once, memorably, at the side of a hospital bed when his father's heart had made an opinion known that his father had refused to acknowledge. It had once seemed to her like the most efficient human mind she had ever watched work in real time. Now she just waited for it to finish. You could have had this sent over, he said. I could have, she agreed. It's a release form. It doesn't require a personal visit. No, she said, it doesn't. She watched him assemble the implication and misread it. She could see the exact moment he decided that her presence meant something sentimental, that 2 years had worn something down, that she had come back with an errand as cover for something softer underneath. She saw him find that conclusion and settle into it. The quiet satisfaction of a man who prefers the version of events where the other person moved first. Vivian. He said her name with a different weight than before. The weight of a name that has accumulated a decade of meaning and is being cashed in carefully. I'm glad you came. There are things I should have said before now. I've been putting off this conversation because I wasn't sure. I have a 9 o'clock meeting I can't move, she said, not unkindly, just plainly. Something shifted in his face. The good faith receded and was replaced by something she recognized as recalibration, the rapid sorting that follows a wrong read, the accommodation of new information, the search for the updated angle. He was good at recalibrating. He always had been. That had once seemed to her like one of his genuine strengths, the ability to absorb being wrong and move forward without spending too much time in the embarrassment of it. What she understood now, with the clarity that 2 years of distance produces, was that the speed of the recalibration was also the problem. He moved forward so quickly from being wrong that he never stayed long enough in the wrong to understand what it had cost. He opened the top drawer of his desk. The folder he placed between them was pale blue and came from a law firm. She knew it before she read it. The weight of it, the quality of the paper, the way he set it down with the deliberateness of a man. Delivering something he has already lived with long enough that the act of delivering it has begun to feel routine. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Caldwell v. Ashworth. You came back after 2 years, he said, and his voice had found the measured, conclusive register of a man delivering a decision already made, already settled, already past the point of being discussed. And this is what you want. He held her gaze for exactly 1 beat. Fine. Sign them. I'll have my attorney file by Thursday. Vivian looked at the folder. She looked at it the way you look at something you have already, in some quiet interior room of yourself, seen before, not because she had known this specific morning was coming on this specific day, but because she had known something like it was always coming eventually, and she had made her peace with it so completely that what she felt now was not shock, and not grief, and not the particular species of relief that people mistake for not caring. It was recognition. The simple, clarifying recognition of a thing confirming what you already, quietly, knew. She picked it up, opened it, read at her normal speed. She had always been a fast reader, and she was not going to perform anything slower today. Settlement terms on page 4. Her eyes moved down the columns, with the focus of someone assessing a document, not a marriage, because the marriage had been assessed already, in full, in a hotel room in Chicago 2 years ago, when she had found a folder
that was not meant for her eyes and had sat with it for 3 hours before she understood what it meant and what she was going to do about it.
She found the line she was looking for. The Whitmore Trust property, she said, without looking up. You have it valued at $8.2 million in the settlement assessment. That's the appraised value. That's the 2022 appraised value. She turned a page. My independent appraisal, conducted last month by Ashworth and Partners and available for your review on page 4 of my folio, places the current market value at 11.4. She looked up at him then, and her voice was completely even, not cold, just precise. The way a number is precise, in a way that doesn't require tone. I'll need the figure corrected before I sign the dissolution papers. Your attorney will have the documentation by end of business tomorrow. The study went very quiet. Ethan looked at her. He had the expression of a man trying to locate a precedent for what is happening in front of him and finding none in the available inventory. The appraisal is 8.2, he said. And even as he said it, she could hear the sentence lose confidence somewhere in the middle. Your family's appraisal is 8.2, she said, with the patience of someone who prepared this sentence many days in advance and is delivering it now without any particular edge, because the edge is already in the number, and the number doesn't need her assistance. She set the dissolution papers down. She reached for the pen on his desk. His pen, the Mont Blanc she had given him on his 38th birthday, which she used without ceremony because it was the nearest and she was not going to make the small things into statements, and signed pages 3, 7, and 12 of the Whitmore Trust release. Clear signatures, unhurried. She initialed both lines on page 12 and pushed the document across the desk toward him. Your turn, she said. He did not move immediately. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him in a very long time, perhaps since the early years, when she had occasionally done something he hadn't anticipated, and he had looked at her for one unguarded second with something that was almost surprise, almost respect, almost the look of a man who sees something clearly and is glad of it. He picked up the pen, signed where she indicated. She took the release back, opened her phone, photographed the signed pages, 3 clean shots, flash off, images sharp, dropped the phone into her pocket, closed the folio. She lifted her coat from the chair arm where she draped it, settled it over her shoulders, and moved toward the door. Vivian. She stopped at the doorframe, one hand on the wood. She did not turn all the way around, just enough that he had the line of her profile, which was precisely the amount of herself she was willing to leave in this room on her way out. Why did you actually come today? His voice had lost every managed register. What was underneath was unedited and rawer than she expected, and she thought, with something that was not quite softness but was adjacent to it, that it might be the most honest thing she had heard from him in years, not the release. Why did you come yourself? She stood in the doorway for a moment. She was deciding not what the answer was. She had known that for a long time, but whether the answer was something she wanted to leave with him. I needed a signature, she said. She left. The front hall was empty except for Mrs. Patton, who appeared from the kitchen corridor with the quiet timing of a woman who has spent 2 decades knowing when to be present and when to disappear. She had Vivian's gloves ready without being asked. The gesture was so precisely the shape of hundreds of departures over 8 years in this house that Vivian felt it somewhere below her sternum, in the specific place where the small, true things land when you're not defending against them. It's cold out today, Mrs. Patton said. It is, Vivian said, and they both meant something else entirely. She stepped through the front door. The November air came in off the park, sharp and carrying the smell of wet leaves and concrete and the particular cleanness of a city that has just been rained on and is not yet dirty again. She stood on the top step for 2 seconds. She always counted, because the body needs 2 seconds to catch up with what the mind has already settled, and walked to the car waiting at the curb. In the back seat, she set the folio on her lap and checked her phone. A calendar notification was waiting, the way it always waited, patient and precise. VA Meridian BLDG, 31F90 AM. She confirmed it. Set the phone face down on the seat. Watched the city move past the window as the car pulled into traffic, the gray park giving way to the gray avenue. Everything the flat silver color of a morning that hasn't decided yet what it wants to be. She thought, briefly, about the pen, about the fact that she had used his pen, the one she had given him, to sign papers in a room where half of everything still had her name attached to it. She had not thought about it in the moment. And she was not going to think about it now. That was the discipline. You didn't let the small things gather weight when you were in the middle of the large ones. The large ones needed the room. On the landing above the front hall, Margaret Caldwell stood at the window that looked down over the entrance steps. She had been there since before the car arrived. Not anxiously. Margaret did not do anxiety, or had trained it into something so controlled over 50 years that the distinction had become academic, but with the deliberate positioning of a woman who prefers to observe from an angle that cannot itself be observed. She had watched Vivian step out of the car in that coat, with that posture, and that complete and infuriating absence of the kind of visible uncertainty that Margaret had been waiting on for 18 months. She had waited while Vivian went inside. She had counted the minutes, which was a habit she would not have admitted to, and which she would have described, if pressed, as simply staying informed. 17 minutes. Then the front door opened, and Vivian walked back to the car. The relief that moved through Margaret was real and private, and she did not permit it to reach her face even in an empty hallway, because she had trained her face as a public surface for so long that the habit held even when there was no audience. The relief was there regardless. The specific, substantial relief of a woman who has managed a complicated piece back into a safer position on the board. Vivian had come, had conducted her business, had left. Ethan would sign the papers. This would close. The Caldwell name would absorb a divorce the way it had absorbed other unpleasantnesses across 3 generations, quietly, completely, without lasting damage to anything that actually mattered. Margaret turned from the window. She did not stop to ask herself why a woman as precise as Vivian Ashworth had crossed the city to collect a signature she could have sent a messenger for. She did not wonder about the folio, or what 8 pages of supporting documentation said about the scope of Vivian's preparation. She did not think about the independent appraisal. She had not been in the room when Ethan's face changed, had not heard the number, did not know the number existed. She went back to her morning. She would have 4 more days before she began to understand what she had not thought to ask. At 9:09, in a conference room on the 31st floor of the Meridian building on 53rd Street, a meeting that Ethan Caldwell did not know existed was already underway. The floor had no signage in the elevator lobby. Access required a key card or someone waiting to receive you, and if you were not expected, you did not arrive. The conference room itself was spare and purposeful. A long table, 8 chairs, no decoration that wasn't functional, the kind of room designed to communicate that the people who use it do not need to impress anyone with the room. On the credenza along the far wall, beside a neat stack of bound documents, sat a single framed photograph, a woman and an older man at what appeared to be a company founding event, both of them grinning in the unguarded way of people who have been working towards something for a long time and have just watched it begin. Vivian sat at the head of the table. She had taken off the charcoal coat and the dark dress, with the west-facing morning light coming in clean across the table. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman in complete possession of a room that was entirely hers, not performing it, simply occupying it, the way you occupy something you built. Folio open, her own pen in hand this time. 3 people on the other side of the table giving her the specific, focused attention of people who do not extend that kind of attention carelessly. The Whitmore release is signed, she said, which means the trust restructure can move forward this week. She turned to the first page of the term sheet. Dana, where are we on the Caldwell Board's response to the pension protection clause? Dana Yee, to her left, opened her folder without hurrying. 2 directors are calling it operationally constraining. The CFO is neutral. He'll vote with whichever direction has the most momentum by the time it comes to a vote. The momentum is going to be ours, Vivian said, with the calm of someone stating a forecast they have already verified, through sources the other party doesn't know they have. I want the term sheet clean and in front of them before they have time to run it through their own restructuring advisors. And make sure it's framed correctly. Dana, this is not us being generous. This is us establishing a standard they should have set 3 years ago and chose not to. Dana made a note. Across the table, her second counsel was already pulling the relevant pages. The principal disclosure question, Dana said, carefully. The room held the quality of a question that everyone present already knows the shape of, if they ask directly. Vivian said, we answer directly. She picked up her coffee, but they won't ask. Not yet. A pause. Brief and unhurried. Not heavy. He's still working out why a release form required a personal delivery. She set the coffee down and turned back to the term sheet, and the meeting went on being a meeting. Clean, forward-moving, precise in a room 31 floors above a city that, as far as Ethan Caldwell was concerned this morning, contained no version of the woman he had just watched walk out his front door. On the Upper East Side, in the study he had occupied for 11 years, Ethan sat at his desk and looked at the dissolution papers she had left behind. She had taken her copy. She had left his. He looked at them for a while. Then he pressed the intercom. James, his assistant, appeared in the doorway in seconds. Sir, the woman who was here this morning. He stopped, not entirely sure yet what he was asking. You said people recognized her. James navigated the question with the composure of a man who has spent 4 years interpreting the space between what Ethan asked and what Ethan meant. 3 staff members mentioned it. Yes, there was a piece in the Financial Standard last month. October issue. Feature profile. The Ashworth family office relaunch. Ethan looked at him. I can pull it up, James offered. Do that. Ethan set the Whitmore Trust release on the corner of his desk. Her signatures, clean and unhurried, his below them. And James, the Whitmore Trust property. What's the current independent market valuation? A half-second of quiet that told its own story. The 2022 appraisal puts it at 8.2. I asked for the current independent valuation. I'll find out, James said. Today if I can. He left. Ethan turned back to his desk. He picked up the dissolution papers, set them down, picked them up again, which was not a habit he recognized in himself, and which he noted without being able to do anything useful about it. He thought about the way she had used his pen, not asked for it, not reached for a different one, just picked up the pen on the corner of his desk, his pen, the one she had given him, with the ease of someone who has not yet decided to return the small liberties, then set it down without ceremony, without comment, without looking at him to see if he had noticed. He thought about the phrase she had used, my independent appraisal, conducted last month, the precision of it, not approximately, not recently, last month, the kind of specificity that belongs to a person who knew, at least a month ago, that she was going to be in this room saying those words. He thought about 3 members of his staff recognizing her from a financial publication he had not read. He had not known there was a financial publication to read. He had not known. And this was the part that sat in him strangely, like something swallowed without enough water, that there was a version of Vivian Ashworth being written about in the financial press, and that this version had apparently existed for at least a month, and that he was the last person in his own household to be aware of her. He put the papers in the desk drawer. Then he took them back out and looked at them, because putting them away felt like agreeing to something he hadn't finished understanding yet. Her handwriting on the Whitmore release was what it had always been. Clear, forward-leaning, entirely legible. The handwriting of a woman who has nothing to obscure. 3 signatures. The same signature she had put on the marriage certificate 9 years ago in a room full of people who were certain they were watching the beginning of something permanent. He supposed they had been watching that. He had just not known, until 57 minutes ago, that she had already decided, had known for some time. It appeared, exactly where the permanent thing ended, outside the window. November pressed its gray and patient face against the glass, and the city went on being the city, indifferent, immense, and full, as it always was, of things happening in rooms that no one had thought to tell him about. The Financial Standard article was 3 pages long. That was the first thing Ethan noticed when James set the printed copy on his desk. Not the headline, not the photograph, but the length. 3 pages. The Financial Standard gave most of its profile subjects 2, occasionally 2.5 if the subject had recently moved a market in a direction no one anticipated. 3 pages was not length. It was a statement. He read it, standing up, which was not how he read things, and he was halfway through the 2nd page before he registered that he had not moved to sit down. The headline, The Quiet Return of Vivian Ashworth. Subhead, after 2 years away from New York's financial world, Ashworth has rebuilt something that no one in that world fully anticipated. The article was careful in the way that good financial journalism is careful, precise about what it could verify, measured about what it could only suggest. arranged with the particular skill of a writer who understands that what you imply between established facts lands harder than what you state directly. The Ashworth Family Office, relaunched 18 months ago under a restructured mandate with a new investment focus. A team of 7, including 2 former senior analysts from funds Ethan recognized by reputation and would have hired himself if they had been available. A track record, 1 fiscal year, early stage, but documented and specific, that the article described, with the financial standards characteristic restraint as quietly outperforming. The photograph was on the second page. Vivian in a conference room he did not recognize, standing at a whiteboard, mid-sentence, turned slightly away from the camera. She was in a dark blazer and she was not looking at the lens, which was either unplanned or the most deliberate editorial choice he had seen all year. She looked like a woman who had something more important to be doing than being photographed. And who was doing it? He set the article down, picked it up, set it down again. He had been married to this woman for 8 years. He had watched her across more dinner tables and in more conference rooms and at more events like the one she had apparently attended in this photograph than he could usefully count. He had watched other people fail to notice her, which had irritated him in a way he had attributed at the time to secondhand professional embarrassment and which he was beginning to understand. Sitting in his study on a gray November Wednesday, as something else entirely, he had also, and this was the part he was having the most difficulty looking at directly, stopped paying attention to her at some point in the last few years. Not dramatically, not in a single decision, in the gradual way that people stop paying attention to things they believe they already fully understand. The article in front of him described someone he recognized and did not fully know, and those two conditions were not supposed to be able to exist simultaneously about the same person after 8 years of marriage. His phone rang. Marcus, his CFO, whose calls over the last 3 months had taken on the quality of a man, delivering the same bad weather report in slightly different language each time. "The Reeve offer is moving," Marcus said when Ethan answered. "They filed the preliminary disclosure this morning. They're going public with the bid by end of the week. Then we need VA to close before they do." Ethan placed the Financial Standard article in his desk drawer, on top of the dissolution papers, which was either coincidence or the desk's own form of commentary. "Tell Dana Yee's office we want a meeting before Thursday, whatever time she can give us." The meeting was Wednesday afternoon. Dana Yee arrived at the Caldwell Group's boardroom with 2 members of her team and a revised term sheet in a bound folder, which she set at the center of the mahogany table with the composed confidence of someone placing something they know is good and are not in a hurry to oversell. She was precise without being cold, and she had the quality of someone who has spent a long time representing a principal who prizes accuracy over performance and has come to embody that standard herself. She did not do preamble. "The governance provisions on page 11 have been restructured," she said, opening directly to that page and turning the document toward Renata, the Caldwell's outside counsel. "Your directors retain more latitude in the transition period than the previous draft allowed. We adjusted in response to the specific concerns your board raised in the last session." She let Renata read for a moment. "The second point of pushback was the pension and long-term benefits clause. I want to address that directly, because I want to be clear about where our principal stands." Ethan had read the previous term sheet 4 times. He had read it the way he read everything, looking for the angle, the soft spot, the clause that would become problematic in the 3rd year of the arrangement when the goodwill of the signing table had dissipated. He had found several things worth negotiating and one thing he couldn't quite categorize. The pension clause was that thing. It was detailed, specific, and written by someone who had thought carefully about it. The kind of provision you write when you actually care about the outcome for the people furthest from the boardroom. It had no obvious financial logic for the acquirer. It served the employees and only the employees. "The clause stands," Dana said, and there was no negotiation in the way she said it, just information. "Our principal's position is that pension and benefit structures are not a concession in her acquisitions. They are a baseline. Every company she acquires maintains them. That has been consistent across her entire portfolio. That's an unusual position for an investor of this size," Marcus said. Carefully. "The way you say something careful when you're not sure if you're supposed to be impressed or suspicious. Yes, Dana said. She's aware of that. Renata turned to the term sheet's letterhead. On the line below VA, Capital's formal name, in the small, clean font of a firm that did not need to announce itself. 31F, Meridian Building, 53rd Street, New York. She noted it without comment. So did Ethan. In the way you note an address that means nothing yet. I'd like to ask your principal a question, Ethan said. Dana looked at him. I'm the appropriate channel. Not about the terms. He kept his voice even. Whether this position, the pension structure, the employee-first language throughout the document, whether it developed from something specific, from watching something go wrong somewhere. I'm asking because whoever wrote this clause has thought about it in a particular way, and I find I want to understand the thinking before I sign underneath it. Dana held his gaze for a moment, long enough that he understood. The pause was deliberate. Our principal takes a patient position, she said, on every investment. She believes the companies she works with are communities before they are assets, and she structures her terms to reflect that. A beat. She has held this position consistently, since before I began working with her. A patient position. The phrase caught somewhere in Ethan's memory the way a thread catches on a rough surface. Briefly, not quite hooking, releasing before he could identify what it had snagged on. He let it go. Filed it in the category of things that felt almost familiar and probably weren't. We'll have our formal response by Friday, he said. I anticipate it will be positive. Dana closed her folder. We hoped it would be. The Dalton Foundation's annual gala was held that evening at the Frick Collection, which was one of those New York institutions that had understood something important about permanence, that it was communicated not through renovation, but through refusal. The same rooms, the same courtyard, the same particular quality of candlelight against old stone that made everyone standing in it look less like people at an event and more like people being remembered. 200 people from the precise stratum of New York where money had aged long enough to become something else. The Caldwells attended every year. Ethan attended because not attending would be noted and would require a reason. His mother attended because Margaret Caldwell, in 40 years of New York social life, had never missed an event where her absence would be read as information. He saw Vivian before she saw him. That was not how it usually went. In the 8 years of their marriage, and in the 5 years before it, when they had moved in overlapping circles, Vivian was someone you registered late in a room. Not because she was quiet, not because she made herself small, but because she had always had the quality of someone who is fully present rather than loudly arrived. And fullness tends to read, in a crowded room, as composure rather than entrance. He had often, in those years, noticed other people noticing her while he was still in conversation with someone else, which was its own category of failure he was only now beginning to name with any accuracy. He saw her from across the courtyard, through the warm and complicated light of the Frick in November, and she was talking to someone, Damian Reeve. Ethan processed this information in the specific, total way that happens when two separate facts arrive simultaneously, and the mind understands, before the reasoning mind is ready, that they belong in the same sentence. Reeve was 45, rangy, the kind of man who had always had more charm than discipline required and had never been meaningfully corrected about how he deployed it. He had built Reeve Partners into something significant enough that when he had decided 3 months ago to come after the Caldwell Group, Ethan's board had taken him seriously on the first day rather than the third, which was its own form of professional compliment. He was also a man Ethan had known at a distance for years, cordial at events like this one, competitive in the abstract, and now, in the last quarter, directly and specifically opposed. He was standing close to Vivian in the way of a man who has chosen his position in a room, not crowded. There was space on either side of him, but selected. The way you select a position rather than fall into it. He had the body language of a man who is entirely focused on the person in front of him, not tracking the room over her shoulder, not looking for someone more useful to be talking to. Vivian was not stepping back. Ethan stood where he was for a moment, which was not like him. He moved through rooms like this one with the habitual forward momentum of a man who always has a direction and a person to greet when he gets there. And standing still in a crowd was not something he did. He did it now. He watched Reeve lean in slightly, not in the way of a man making an approach, but in the way of a man listening with his whole attention. and he watched Vivian respond to something. Her expression shifting at the corner of her mouth in the way he knew was not her social smile. Her social smile was a half-degree wider, a half-degree warmer, and it ended about 1 second before it would have been real. What she had now was different, smaller, slower. It arrived somewhere behind her eyes in a way the social smile never did. He had no authorized claim to what he was feeling. He had set a folder on a desk this morning and said, in the decisive voice he had carefully prepared, that his attorney would file by Thursday. The thing he was feeling right now was not something he could justify or prosecute a reasonable defense for. He knew that. It did not leave. Margaret appeared at his elbow with the silent efficiency of a woman who has been watching from a better angle. "Don't," she said, which was the most compact version of a longer sentence. "I'm not doing anything. You're standing still at a Dalton gala," she said, in the social voice that made significant things sound like weather, which is considerably more visible than you think. She took a measured sip of champagne. "She came for a signature this morning. She's conducting her business. What you're seeing is a conversation at a charity event. Reeve knows her." A pause that was a fraction too long. They run in overlapping circles. The financial world at this level is a smaller room than it appears. He's used her first name twice in 4 minutes. Ethan said, "Not Mrs. Caldwell. Vivian." Margaret's expression did not change in any way that could be pointed to, which was itself a change. When Margaret Caldwell was comfortable, her face had a particular quality of engineered warmth, deliberate but not dishonest, the result of 4 decades of making the management of social situations into a form of skill. When the expression went completely still, it meant something underneath it was in motion. "Come," she said. "The Harrington people have been looking for a conversation about the infrastructure fund." He let himself be steered, because the alternative was continuing to stand at the edge of a courtyard, watching his ex-wife not look for him. Across the room, the conversation between Vivian and Damian Reeve continued for another 20 minutes. They talked about a restructuring in the infrastructure sector she had been watching, and about a board he was considering joining, and about a mutual connection in the London office of a fund they had both, at different points, worked alongside. Reeve was a good conversationalist, specific, curious, genuinely interested in what the other person thought rather than waiting for his turn. And Vivian appreciated that about him in the practical way she appreciated competence, as a quality, not as a feeling. He did not ask about the divorce. He knew, because people in this room knew things, and because he was not the kind of man who pretended not to know them. But he also understood that the divorce was not something to be raised over Frick Collection champagne by a man who had ambitions of his own that would benefit from Vivian Ashworth's continued goodwill. So he didn't raise it. She didn't raise it either. She was aware, from the moment he had looked across the courtyard, that Ethan had been watching. She had not turned her head. She had not given the awareness any of the attention it was asking for. She had continued her conversation with the focus of someone who does not permit the peripheral to become the central unless she has decided to let it. What she had not fully prepared for was the particular quality of his stillness. Ethan Caldwell did not stand still in rooms. He moved through them with the specific velocity of a man who has always known his own direction. She had known that about him for 11 years, and she had found it compelling, and had later found it exhausting, and had finally, in the last 2 years, stopped finding it anything except data. But he had been still tonight. She filed that away somewhere without deciding yet what folder it belonged in. Reeve found Ethan near the bar at 10:45. Caldwell. He had the ease of a man who does not find it contradictory to be charming to the person whose company he is attempting to acquire. "Good to be somewhere without lawyers between us." "Damian," Ethan kept his voice level. "I wasn't aware you and Vivian knew each other. It came out as information, which was what he intended, and Reeve received it as information, which was either good faith or a more sophisticated version of not." "Sure," Reeve said, in the specific register of casual that isn't quite. "We've crossed paths a few times over the last year." "She's sharp. You'd know that better than anyone." A pause that was not quite a smile. "She seems to be doing well." Ethan looked at him and said nothing, because nothing was the answer that gave the least away, and he was in the middle of a negotiation with this man that was not limited to the financial. Reeve held the eye contact for a moment, then shifted register entirely, with the smoothness of someone who has always been good at gear changes. "My buyout offer still stands." personal stake, full valuation, clean exit. You walk away whole and let the board sort out the rest. He said it in the tone of a man, providing useful information to someone who needs it. Sometimes the best position is the one where you come out intact. Ethan, think about it. I'll keep that in mind, Ethan said, which meant nothing, and both of them knew it. Reeve nodded once, and his gaze moved briefly to a point past Ethan's left shoulder before returning, and then he moved back toward the center of the room. Ethan did not turn to look at what he had glanced at. He stood with his drink and looked at the middle distance and thought, very carefully, about a first name used twice in 4 minutes, and about a term sheet with an unusual pension clause, and about a phrase, a patient position, that was still sitting somewhere in the back of his mind, like a key he'd picked up and set down before he realized what had opened. Margaret made the call at 11:20 from the back of the car, keeping her voice low even though she was alone, which was a habit she had maintained since the year she stopped, trusting that privacy could be assumed. The contact at the Gazette answered on the second ring. Weekend edition, she said. Background only. Nothing traceable to a source with a stake in the story. She looked at the passing lights of the avenue. The ex-wife. She's in New York, which is already a story. I want the emphasis on context, the circumstances of the separation. The marriage was under strain. She left under difficult conditions. There are people close to the family, unnamed close, who have questions about the motivation behind her recent reappearance in the city. A pause while she let him ask his one question. No, not an attack. Just enough. Set the room and let people draw their conclusions. That's all it takes. She ended the call. She looked out the window with the expression of a woman who has managed complicated situations for 40 years and has not yet encountered one she could not find a path through. Given sufficient attention and sufficient resources, she had both. She had always had both. She did not think about Vivian's folio and the 8 pages inside it, and an independent property appraisal conducted last month by a firm she had not known to monitor. She did not think about the 3 financial standard pages. She did not think about the address on the VA capital term sheet that Renata had noted and that had been sitting in a boardroom on the 43rd floor since 3 o'clock. She thought about what she knew, which was considerable, and not about what she didn't, which was the only mistake she had ever reliably made. Vivian's car moved through the city at 11:30 with the particular ease of late-night Manhattan. Fewer vehicles, cleaner lines, the grid of it visible the way it isn't during the day when everything fills with urgency and direction. She sat in the back with her coat over her knees and her phone face down on the seat, and her mind doing what it did after events like this, sorting, categorizing, determining what had been useful and what had been noise. She thought about the gala for 45 seconds. That was longer than she had planned. She had not intended to register Ethan's stillness. She had built the architecture of the last 18 months precisely so that none of his reactions would become material to her decisions. She had done it carefully, systematically, in the same way she had built the rest of it, one deliberate layer at a time, each one a degree more removed from the woman who had stood in a hotel room in Chicago 2 years ago and sat with a folder for 3 hours before she could move. She was mostly removed now. She had arrived at a place she would describe, if she were being precise, as functional distance, the kind that holds under ordinary conditions. His stillness, from across a courtyard, under the particular candlelight of a room built for memory. That was not quite ordinary conditions. She set the phone face up on the seat and checked her messages without reading them. Then she set it face down again. The term sheet was in good shape. Dana had reported the meeting's tone as positive. The Whitmore release was signed. The timeline was holding. There were 11 days until she needed to make a decision about the principal disclosure. And in 11 days, a great deal could become clear or could become complicated. And either way she would handle it the way she handled everything, one deliberate step at a time, in the direction she had already chosen, without letting the noise from the rooms she was passing through become louder than the work. She was mostly convincing, sitting in the back of a car that was carrying her through a city that contained, somewhere in the 43rd floor of a building on 6th Avenue, a man who had spent this evening standing still in the one way she had not predicted, mostly. The documents came at 8:47 in the morning, delivered by a paralegal from Vivian's legal team, who did not come inside the building, but waited in the lobby and handed the sealed envelope to James, who brought it upstairs and set it on Ethan's desk without comment, because James had been good at reading the room for 4 years, and this was not a room that wanted comment. Inside, 2 copies of the final dissolution decree, one for each party, a cover letter from the office of Ashworth, Crane and Mehta, explaining, in the clean professional language of people who arrange endings for a living, that the matter of Caldwell v. Ashworth had been concluded as of 9 o'clock that morning, and that both parties were now legally free to act accordingly. Ethan looked at the decree for approximately 30 seconds. Then he put it in the locked drawer where he kept things that were resolved. By 9:15, he was on a call about the Reeve acquisition disclosure. By 9:40, he was reviewing the language Marcus had drafted for the board response. The morning moved with the specific momentum of a man who makes his peace with a thing by putting it somewhere it can't interrupt him. And the morning accepted this arrangement and cooperated. He did not think, until much later, about the fact that he had not felt relief when he put the decree away. The VA Capital formal acquisition offer arrived at 3:17 that afternoon, not the preliminary term sheet they had been negotiating around for months. The formal offer, binding, specific, comprehensive, with a cover letter indicating that the principal had authorized execution and was prepared to move to close on a compressed timeline, conditional on one face-to-face meeting with Ethan and the board's lead director before signature. The timing, dissolution finalized in the morning, formal offer in the afternoon, was not something anyone in the boardroom remarked on aloud. It was the kind of thing you noticed and then looked around the table to see if anyone else had noticed and then decided, collectively and without discussion, to leave sitting there in the category of things that didn't affect the decision in front of you. Marcus noticed his expression when he set the offer on the conference table had the particular quality of a man who has connected 2 facts and is deciding whether making the connection is his job today. Ethan, read the offer from the first page to the last without looking up. The pension clause was unchanged. The governance provisions had been restructured as Dana had described. The valuation was precise and fair, and this was the thing he kept returning to as he read. Written by someone who understood the company, not from the outside, not from the financials alone, but from the inside. The language used to describe the Caldwell Group's core business lines was the language of someone who had read everything available and had also understood what wasn't written down, the culture of the company, the specific areas of organizational fragility, the places where the next 3 years would require careful management rather than aggressive growth. It was the language of someone who had been paying close attention for a long time. He looked up at Suzanne Park, the board's lead director, who had been with the Caldwell Group for 11 years and who had, in Ethan's experience, the finest judgment in any room on questions that required both financial rigor and genuine human understanding simultaneously. "We proceed," he said, "conditional on a face-to-face with the principal before we execute." He set the document down. "I want to meet whoever wrote this." The call from Reeve came at 5 o'clock, not through lawyers, not through an intermediary. Reeve called directly, on the personal number that only a specific category of people had, which was itself a signal about what kind of conversation this was going to be. "I heard you're moving to close with your mystery investor," Reeve said. He had a gift for treating information he wasn't supposed to have as though it were common knowledge, which Ethan had always found either impressive or irritating, depending on which side of a table they were on. "Before you do, I want to put something on the table, not through attorneys, between us." "I'm listening," Ethan said. "The buyout offer from the Frick. I want to formalize it. Full valuation. Your personal stake, Marcus's stake, the family's historic holdings. You walk out whole and intact. The company restructures under Reeve Partners, but the operational teams stay largely in place. I have no interest in dismantling what functions." A pause, precisely long enough to sound like a man choosing his next words rather than reciting them. "Ethan, the VA structure is going to cost you governance. Whoever is behind that offer. The oversight provisions are not designed for a CEO who is accustomed to running his own shop. The governance provisions are manageable. From where you're sitting today." Yes, the confidence in Reeve's voice was not unearned. He had been in enough of these conversations to know where the seams gave. "From where you'll be sitting in year 3, with a principal you've never met, holding veto rights on capital allocation decisions. That calculus changes. Ethan was standing at his office window with the last of the November light going flat and gray across the avenue, and he was thinking about 160 people in the Caldwell Group building who had been with the company for more than a decade, some of them since his father ran it, and about the pension clause written by someone who had thought about those people specifically, and about what it cost to be the person who made the call that sent them somewhere else. He had been running the numbers on the Reeve buyout for 3 months in the privacy of his own thinking, and the numbers worked. The numbers almost always worked. That had never once been the question. The answer is no, he said, a beat of silence on Reeve's end. Then, shifting register with the smoothness of a man who treats losing around as information. She said you'd say that. 2 words, she said. Vivian. Reeve said her name the way he'd said it at the Frick, with the ease of familiarity, with the absence of any qualifier. I told her I was going to make one more approach before the offer closed, she said. He paused, and Ethan could hear the editing happening in real time, the selection of what to share and what to withhold. She said, you would make the decision you thought was right for the people who work for you, not for yourself, and that I should factor that in before I prepared my pitch. A quality entered his voice that Ethan had not heard from him before, something close to genuine interest. The way a man sounds when he has encountered something that changed his model. Turns out she was right about you. Ethan said nothing. I'll see you around, Reeve said, with the cheerful composure of a man who has lost the hand and is not yet close to done with the game. The call ended. Ethan stood at his window. She said you would make the decision you thought was right for the people who work for you. He sat with that sentence in the specific way he sat with things that required more room than he had immediately available. He had spent 3 months managing the Reeve situation from every angle, legal, financial, reputational, tactical, and had not once, in all of that management, considered what Vivian Ashworth thought about how he would handle it, had not considered that she would have a view, had not considered that the view would be specific and informed and accurate enough that Reeve had factored it into a negotiation strategy. She had apparently said it before he made the decision, which meant she had not been predicting. She had been reporting what she already knew, the way you report something you verified a long time ago. He opened his laptop and pulled up the 3 financial standard links James had sent that morning. He read all 3 articles. He read 2 of them twice. Then he looked up the address on the VA. Capital Formal Offers cover letter, 31F, Meridian Building, 53rd Street. He knew the building. He had walked past it every morning for 4 years when the Caldwell Group's offices had been on Park Avenue. He knew the lobby. Marble, spare. The kind of lobby that doesn't announce itself because the address handles that. He had never had occasion to go above the 10th floor. He closed the laptop. He did not yet know what he was assembling. He only knew that the pieces were arranging themselves with a coherence that felt like something, and that the something had been in front of him for longer than he had been looking at it. Vivian was in her hotel suite at 7:30, working through a due diligence stack spread across the low sitting room table, when someone knocked at the door. She was not expecting anyone. Dinner was ordered for 8, and the knock was too early and too deliberate for room service. She crossed to the door and looked through the peephole with the careful attention of someone who has learned that small precautions are not paranoia, but arithmetic. Margaret Caldwell stood in the corridor. She had not called ahead. That alone was diagnostic. Margaret called ahead for everything. It was her primary instrument of control, the ability to set the shape of an arrival before it happened. Appearing unannounced at her son's ex-wife's hotel suite was not a first move. It was what you did when the first moves had not been sufficient. Vivian opened the door. Margaret was in a charcoal cashmere coat, assembled with the precision of a woman who treats her appearance as the first sentence of every conversation. Her expression was the specific face she used for situations she was actively managing, composed, contained, offering exactly what she had decided to offer and nothing adjacent to it. Margaret, Vivian said. Her voice was pleasant and carried nothing it hadn't chosen to carry. This is unexpected. I won't keep you long. Margaret's eyes moved briefly past Vivian's shoulder. A quick, comprehensive sweep of the room behind her. The files on the table. The dinner setting for one. The organized purposefulness of a woman who does not intend a long stay but intends to use the time precisely. She cataloged what she saw without letting the cataloging reach her expression. I wanted to speak with you directly, without attorneys between us. Vivian stepped back from the doorway. Not all the way. Enough to make a conversation in the corridor available. Not enough to extend the invitation inside. You came back for the co-signatory release, Margaret said, with the deliberateness of a woman who has rehearsed the opening of this conversation and is delivering it as planned. You have it. The decree is filed. The settlement terms will be finalized in the coming weeks, and they'll be fair. I'll make certain of that. She held Vivian's gaze with the steady assurance of a woman who has been shaping other people's choices for 40 years and finds it as natural as breathing. What I want to understand is what you're still doing in New York. Vivian waited. The company is managing a serious institutional pressure. Margaret continued. Ethan is focused. He does not need complications in his personal landscape while he's carrying that. Her tone remained pleasant. She was too skilled to let it sharpen. Too experienced to underestimate what sharpness cost you. You have built something. Clearly. I've read about it. I'm glad for you. Genuinely. But you are in New York, attending events in Ethan's circles, conducting business with people he works alongside. That creates a noise that he does not need and that serves neither of you. She paused, giving the next sentence its own space. Take what you came for. Finish your business. And go back to what you've been building. Quietly and soon. I'm asking you directly because I believe you understand directness. The corridor held its silence. Vivian looked at Margaret Caldwell for a long, unhurried moment. Not with the anger she might have felt 2 years ago. Not with the grief she would have felt a year ago. With the specific, clear quality of attention she now reserved for things she needed to see precisely. The slight tension in Margaret's jaw that her expression was not quite managing to cover. The way her right hand held the strap of her bag a half-degree tighter than the situation required. The barely perceptible quality in her eyes that was not quite certainty. The quality of a woman who has come here because she is afraid, and who has dressed the fear in the language of management so thoroughly that she may not be able to see it herself. I think, Vivian said, and her voice was entirely even. Not cold, not sharp, but carrying the specific weight of something considered and chosen. That you have fundamentally misunderstood who is making things complicated for whom. She let it sit for exactly the right number of seconds. Not performing, just allowing. Good night, Margaret, she said. It's cold out. Get home safely. She closed the door. Not a slam. Not a statement. The way a well-made door closes when someone confident is on the other side of it, with the quiet, final click of something that knows it fits its frame. She stood in the entryway for a moment. Listening, she could hear, faintly, the sound of Margaret's heels on the corridor floor. Steady pace, moving toward the elevator, not hurried. Margaret would not hurry in a hotel corridor, regardless of what she was feeling. She would walk at the pace of someone entirely in command of her evening. That was the discipline of a woman who had never, in 50 years, permitted a situation to run her in public. Vivian turned and walked to the window. Manhattan at 7:30 in November was the city assembling itself from the inside out, the lights arriving block by block until the whole enormous thing was present and brilliant and entirely indifferent in the way that only very large things can manage indifference. She stood at the glass with one hand resting lightly against the frame, and for 2 minutes she did not manage anything at all. Not her expression. Not the tightness in her chest that had settled somewhere during Margaret's sentence about Ethan not needing complications in his personal landscape. The specific ache of a woman who has spent 18 months building something, partly because building was the only reliable anesthetic for what she was apparently still carrying, and who has just been reminded, in the corridor of a hotel she is staying in alone, that the anesthetic was not a cure, not the knowledge, sitting flat and clear at the center of all of it. That she had done exactly the right thing by closing that door and saying what she had said, and that doing the right thing had not stopped it from being hard. That was the thing she had not been able to explain to anyone in 2 years, because the people who loved her wanted her to be more healed than she was, and she had not wanted to disappoint them. It was hard. She was doing it anyway. Those two things were both true, and they would continue to be true until they weren't, and she was not yet certain when that would be. She counted. 2 minutes. That was the rule she had given herself in the first months after Chicago. When she understood that what she was carrying was real and was going to need somewhere to go, and that giving it unlimited space would cost her the architecture she was building inside it. 2 minutes, each time, enough to make it real, not enough to let it run. She turned back to the table. She sat down, opened the next file in the due diligence stack. The files were organized by acquisition quarter, and she was in the fourth quarter of 2019, and there were 6 more to work through before tomorrow morning. She worked. The file third from the bottom was a research memo from VA, Capital's internal analysis team, prepared 4 months ago, which Dana had flagged for her attention and which she had read twice at the time and had returned to, intermittently, since. The memo concerned employee retention data across VA's existing portfolio. In the third paragraph, under a section heading on acquisition philosophy, Dana's lead analyst had written, "The Ashworth principle, as it has come to be understood internally, holds that the structural health of a company is legible in how it treats the people furthest from the decision-making table. Pension integrity, benefits continuity, and long-term employment security are treated as diagnostic indicators of institutional health, not as cost variables to be optimized." The analyst had named it after her, without asking, using it in internal documents as shorthand for a way of thinking that had, over 18 months, become the operating philosophy of every deal VA. Capital touched. Vivian had read it the first time, with the discomfort of a person who has been named by someone else, for something she thought of simply as correct behavior, not a philosophy, not a principle, just the obvious way to think about people inside a company you were proposing to be responsible for. She had said nothing to Dana about it. She had not known what to say, and she had filed it in the drawer, reserved for things she would feel about when the right moment arrived. She read it again now, and she thought about the formal acceptance request that had come back through Dana that afternoon, the face-to-face, before signature, with the principal. She thought about what Ethan had said in the boardroom. According to Dana's note, whoever wrote this offer understood something about what this company actually is. I find I want to understand the thinking before I sign underneath it. She set the memo down. She picked up her pen, put it down again, picked it up. 11 days. She had 11 days before the principal disclosure question moved from optional to necessary. Before the meeting, she had agreed to give him enough proximity to ask the right questions, and she would be required, by the terms she herself had set, to answer them directly. 11 days in which any number of variables could shift, including some she could not control and some she had not yet fully accounted for. She thought about his stillness at the Frick. She thought about what Reeve had told him on the phone. She knew Reeve well enough to know he would have said something. It was not in his nature to leave useful information unused, and what she had told him had been useful in the way she intended, designed to move Ethan toward the right decision without touching him directly. She had not anticipated that Reeve would tell him she'd said it. She opened the next file. Outside the window, the city held its lights against the dark with the effortless permanence of something that has been doing this for a long time and expects to continue. And Vivian Ashworth, one hand moving steadily across a page of due diligence notes, did what she had been doing for 18 months. She worked, and she did not let the window take more of her attention than she had allocated for it. She gave it one more second, then she turned the page. The Meridian building's limestone facade had accumulated the specific gray patina of a midtown building that had been doing its job without interruption since 1974. Not dirty, not elegant, simply permanent, in the way that certain New York buildings achieve permanence, by deciding they don't require anyone's opinion of them. Ethan had driven past this building every morning for 4 years. When the Caldwell Group's offices had been on 6th Avenue, his car had come down 53rd every day, and this lobby had been a recurring background detail, the way the city's background details always were, noted and filed, and granted no further significance than the building beside it or the one beside that. He noticed, stepping through the revolving door behind Marcus and Renata, that the lobby was exactly as he remembered it from the sidewalk view. Marble, spare, lit without grandeur. The kind of lobby that does not introduce itself because the address handles that. The elevator to the 31st floor opened into a corridor with no signage. 2 chairs, and a woman at a reception desk who looked at all three of them and said, "Mr. Caldwell, Mr. Song, Miss Park, Dana is expecting you." She had their names without checking anything in front of her. He filed that. The conference room ran the length of the building's east face, with windows that looked out over 53rd Street, and it was spare in the specific way of a room that has never needed to compensate for anything with decoration. Long table, 10 chairs, bound documents at each seat that communicated, "We are prepared, and we expected you to be the same." Dana Yee was already standing when they came in. She had brought 2 members of her team, a counsel and an analyst, both carrying the focused composure of people who understand that what happens in the next 2 hours matters. She shook hands with all 3 of them without hurrying it. "Thank you for making the time," she said. And the sentence managed to be courteous and entirely without deference at once. "The timeline is ours as much as yours," Ethan said. He took the seat across from her. "Let's be efficient." Agreed, and it was efficient. For the first 40 minutes, they moved through the governance provisions in the way of people who have been building toward this conversation across months of preliminary work and have arrived at it wanting to finish. The restructured oversight clauses, the transition timeline, the capital allocation provisions and the veto thresholds, and the quarterly review structure that Renata had spent 2 weeks proposing amendments to, and that Dana's team had responded to, in each case, with counterproposals so precise and well-reasoned that Renata had told Ethan in the cab over that whoever was doing the legal work on the VA side was someone she would have hired herself. "Page 19, Dana said. "The independent board appointments. Your counsel has proposed a 6-month deferral on the second seat. The rationale is operational," Renata said. "Simultaneous board restructuring and executive transition creates a management burden that—" "We're not concerned about the management burden," Dana said. "We're concerned about the exposure it creates. A 6-month window with an incomplete board structure and a principal investor without full representation is a window that can be used." She turned to page 19 and placed her pen at the relevant clause. 2 months, not 6. We maintain the original timeline." Renata looked at Ethan. 2 months, Ethan said. The counter had been a test, and everyone at the table knew it, and no one said so. Because that was how this kind of meeting worked. You established what you would hold and what you would give. And you established it through the conversation, rather than before it. And by the end, you had something real, rather than a document constructed before the people in it had taken each other's measure. Ethan was taking measure. He had been doing it since they sat down. Not just of Dana, who was excellent at what she did and who had, as he had observed across 3 months of negotiation, the quality of someone who had internalized a set of values from her principles so thoroughly that she would make the same decisions alone that she would make in the room. He was taking measure of the documents themselves, the specific architecture of the offer. The pension clause was on page 23. He had read it 4 times in his office and was reading it again now, in the room, with the language in front of him. "The employee benefits provision," he said, "specifically the pension continuity guarantee. In the last session, you told me your principal takes a patient position." "That's right," Dana said. "I've been thinking about that phrase." He kept his voice even. The way he kept it even when he was following a thread and didn't want to signal how far he had followed it. Patient suggests an orientation toward long-term returns, but the pension guarantee costs in year 1 and year 2 before it produces measurable return. The protection it extends is real, but it doesn't optimize for the investor, which means it was written from a position that isn't purely financial. Dana held his gaze. "Our principle is that the structural health of a company is legible in how it treats the people furthest from the decision-making table." The sentence arrived in the room and sat there. Something moved at the back of Ethan's mind. Not arrived yet, not fully formed. The specific quality of something approaching recognition that hasn't cleared the horizon. He had heard that formulation before, not from Dana, in a different room, in a different year. From someone who had said it with the specific directness of a person stating something they had arrived at through genuine thought rather than received wisdom, and who had looked at him when they said it with the mild, patient expression of someone who expected to be taken seriously and was simply waiting to see whether they would be. He had been in a different part of the conversation. He had not followed that thread. He looked down at page 23. It was the motion. Later, that he couldn't reconstruct precisely. The way the eye moves from what it's reading toward something in the peripheral field that has registered as worth attention without involving the deliberate mind. He looked up. His gaze crossed the room and landed on the credenza along the far wall. On the credenza, beside a neat stack of quarterly reports and a water glass, was a framed photograph. Two people, an older man, silver-haired, with the posture of someone who has occupied rooms like this one for 40 years and does not need to signal the comfort of it, and a woman laughing. Not the controlled version of a smile that people produce for professional photographs, but the real thing, the full, unguarded version that arrives before you've decided whether to allow it. They were standing outside a building. The photograph was angled so that the building's facade was visible behind them, and what was visible was a limestone facing, a setback at the upper floors, and the particular window arrangement of the east face. He looked at the photograph for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the window on the east wall of the conference room. Outside, limestone, the setback at the upper floors. Exactly that proportion, exactly that position. The window arrangement he had been looking at for 40 minutes without registering, because it was to his left when he sat down and he had not turned toward it. He looked back at the photograph. He looked at the woman laughing. The world did the thing it does when two facts that have been inside the same mind for different amounts of time arrive at the same location simultaneously. It did not announce itself. It simply became present. The way a hidden image becomes present in one of those pictures that holds two things at once. Suddenly you cannot unsee it, and you can no longer reconstruct what you were looking at a moment before. Ethan set his pen down on page 23, he said, very carefully. With the precision of a man who wants to be certain he is asking exactly the question he means to ask. What does VA stand for? The conference room went quiet in the specific way of a room that has been waiting for something and has just had it arrive. Dana paused. It was not the pause of someone without an answer. It was the deliberate, authorized pause of someone who has been told, if they ask this question directly, you answer it directly. A pause that said, yes, we are at this moment now, and I have been waiting for it, and I know what I'm permitted to say. Vivian Ashworth, she said. The room did not change. Everything in it changed. Ethan sat with the full weight of what he had just understood, and he let it come, because there was no other option. You could not manage this, could not find the angle that made it rearrangeable, could not do the thing he had spent his adult life doing with information he wasn't ready for. Sort it, file it, make it useful before it could make something of him. This was not sortable. This was 18 months of board meetings and late-night calls with Marcus and the specific grinding anxiety of watching something his father built
and his own hands had shaped moving toward an edge he couldn't stop by himself.
All of it. And on the other side of it, behind a legal architecture that had been constructed with the particular precision of someone who knows exactly what they are designing and why, was his ex-wife, 14 days divorced. The investor his company had been begging to save it. She had been in this building. He had driven past this building on 53rd every morning for 4 years. He had walked past it at lunch. He had walked past it on nights when he came down from the office and needed the air and took the long way. And he had walked past it on one specific morning 2 years ago when he had left for work at 6:15 with something sitting in him that he hadn't yet decided what to do with. He had walked past this building carrying things he should have handled differently, and she had been inside it, and he had not looked up. Marcus, across the table, had the expression of a man who has just understood something significant and has made the decision, correctly, to be very still about it. Renata had set her pen down. Neither of them spoke. They were both too good at this room for that. I would like to speak with your principal, Ethan said. He heard his own voice from a slight distance. The way you hear it when the whole of your attention is occupied and none of it is available for monitoring the sound. Now, today, in this room. Dana looked at him for a moment. I'll need to check her availability. Please. Dana stood, left her documents on the table, which told him something about her confidence in the next 5 minutes, and walked out. The door closed with the sound of a well-built door, quiet and complete. The three of them sat. Marcus looked at the table, then at Ethan, then at the table again. Renata turned her pen over in her fingers once, slowly, then set it flat. Ethan, Marcus said, in a careful voice. I know, Ethan said. The timeline. I know, not sharply. With the complete flatness of a man holding something very carefully and unable to manage the additional weight of anyone else's reaction to it just yet. Marcus was quiet. The 15 minutes that followed were the longest Ethan had spent in a conference room in his adult life. He looked at the surface of the table, which was mahogany and old, and had been in this room for a long time and had no opinion about any of it. He was grateful for that. He thought about the things he now understood that he had not understood an hour ago. The pension clause, the Ashworth principle. He had seen that phrase in the analytical memo attached to the due diligence package and had not stopped to ask what the name referred to, because names of internal frameworks meant nothing to him and he had not been looking for one. He had been looking at numbers. He had been looking at the deal, a patient position. Vivian had used those words at a Caldwell family dinner 5-6 years ago. He couldn't locate the year in the stack of years when she had been describing her view on a fund restructure, and he had been half in another conversation and had caught the phrase as it passed and registered it as hers and moved on. He had moved on. That was what he did. He moved forward from things before he'd fully arrived in them, and the things were still there when he came back around. But he was always somewhere else by then. She had been 6 months into a plan that had taken 18 months to build, and she had been in this building for most of that time. And she had been on the other side of a legal wall, constructed specifically so that he could not see through it. And she had watched him move through his crisis and make his choices and refuse Reeves' offer. And at no point had she let him know that the face on the other side of all of it was hers. The door opened. Dana came back. She held it open without stepping through it. Vivian walked into the room. She was in the dark dress from the Financial Standard photograph. He saw that in the first second and registered it as the kind of detail that would have meant nothing to him before today and now meant something he didn't yet have the right word for. Her hair was back. She carried a folder, not the folio from his front hall, but a different one, a professional folder, and she placed it on the table as she took Dana's seat with the unhurried authority of someone sitting down in a room that belongs to them and has always belonged to them. She was not looking at him yet. She was opening the folder to a specific page, setting her pen parallel to the document, the complete, unconstructed composure of someone who comes to this room every day. Then she looked up. He was on his feet, pure reflex, no decision in it at all. The standing up that happens before the mind has weighed in on whether the gesture is warranted. The physical response of a person encountering something significant before the reasoning mind has sorted out what to do about it. He was standing and he had not chosen it. And across the table Vivian's eyes met his, and she registered this without the composure shifting by a degree he could have pointed to. He sat back down. She looked at him with the face he had known for 11 years, composed, direct, with the quality he had spent those years calling self-possession and was now understanding, with the specific clarity of arriving at something too late, as something earned rather than innate. Not the quality of a person who has always been this way, the quality of a person who has paid for this way, who has arrived at it through something that cost them, and who carries it now not as a surfaced but as a fact about themselves. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, and his name in her mouth was a sentence that contained an argument, which was that she was here as VA, Capital's principal, and was not going to be the one to step outside that frame. That was his choice. You wanted a meeting with the principal. You have it. She placed one hand flat on the open folder in front of her, and her eyes were level and entirely readable and entirely unsparing. Do you want to finalize the transaction, or do you want to discuss something else? The question removed every exit except one, except that there were in fact 2 exits, and both of them led somewhere he wasn't ready for. If he said the transaction, he was accepting the frame, signing documents she had written, in a room she had built, while Marcus and Renata watched, without saying a single word about the 18 months between them, or the 14 days since the decree, or the fact that she had been here, in this building, on this floor, at this table, every day while he was on the other side of a wall he didn't know existed. If he said something else, he was doing it in front of witnesses, and she had control of every door in the room and had made no indication of what was behind any of them. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he had not looked at her in his sitting room 8 days ago, when she had signed the Whitmore Trust release with his pen and photographed the pages and left in 17 minutes. He had not looked at her then, because he had believed he already knew what he was looking at. He had 8 years of information. He had known her. He had 18 months of a completely different kind of evidence. She had studied his board votes. He could see it now, retrospective and complete. A principal who monitored portfolio companies with the attention of someone who cared what they actually did. She had been watching him refuse to cut the pension structure in the 2022 restructure, the call that had cost him a brutal quarter and 2 difficult board meetings. She had watched him vote against the Reeve preliminary offer the first time it came up, 6 months before Reeve went public. She had been watching him be a specific kind of person. She had structured these acquisition terms around what she had observed, and she had told Reeve, with the confidence of someone reporting verified data, not making a prediction, that he would make the right call for the people who worked for him. She had known that about him, from a building he drove past every day, for 18 months, and she had been going to let him sign these papers without ever knowing she was the one holding them. That was the thing he could not put down. Not the shock of the photograph and the question, and Dana's measured answer. Those had their own weight, but weight that could be held. This was different. This was the question underneath everything, sitting at the center of 18 months like something structural and foundational. She had been going to close this deal, walk out of these offices, let Reeve's final approach go unreturned and the dissolution decree go filed. And she had been going to do all of it in such a way that Ethan Caldwell would spend the rest of his career running a company that the woman he had failed to see clearly had quietly, completely, and permanently rescued. And he never would have known it was her. She would have saved everything he loved, and she would have disappeared without a word, and he would never have known. He looked at her across the table. Vivian, he said, and her name came out without a single managed register, without the professional frame, without any of the things he had been placing in front of it for 8 days. It came out the way her name came out in the good years, when he said it and meant something specific by it. It came out like something that had been waiting behind everything else and had found, finally, an opening. Something moved across her face, not the professional composure, not the controlled stillness, the real thing. Underneath those, the specific, involuntary flicker of a person hearing their own name said in a way they were not braced for, in a room they built to protect themselves from exactly this. It was gone in under a second. But it had been there. He had seen it, and seeing it was the first true piece of information he had received from her in 2 years, and it landed in him the way true things land, quietly, completely, without asking permission. She held his gaze. Her eyes were the eyes he had known and not seen clearly, and she said, with the absolute, undecorated directness of someone who has run out of frames to put between herself and the question, "I asked you first." Across the table, Marcus looked at the ceiling. Renata turned her pen over once in her fingers and set it flat. The room waited. He did not answer. Not in those minutes. In that room, with 2 legal teams present and the acquisition documents open between them. The structure of the meeting had moved outside itself and had not found a new shape, and nobody at the table had a procedure for what came next. And Vivian was the only person present who had built one. She closed her folder, picked it up, looked at Dana and said, quietly, 15 minutes. The garden terrace. She stood. She looked at Ethan one last time across the table. The look of a woman who has spent 18 months on one side of a wall and has just had it come down without her permission, via a man who noticed a photograph on a credenza and who is deciding, in this moment, in real time, what she wants to exist on the other side. The transaction can close Thursday, she said. I'll need your answer by tomorrow morning. She looked at Marcus, Mr. Song. She looked at Renata, Miss Park. Then she was moving toward the door with the purpose of someone who has said what they came to say and is deciding the rest somewhere private. The door opened. She walked through it. She did not look back. The door closed. Ethan sat in the conference room with the acquisition documents and his CFO and his outside counsel and the framed photograph on the credenza and the November light coming clean through the east-facing windows. And he thought about a woman who had been in this building while he drove past it 300 times, who had watched him from a distance he didn't know existed and had built something around what she saw, who had been going to let him take the deal and walk out with his company intact and his employees protected and his father's institution saved. and never once let him know that the hands holding all of it were hers. She would have saved everything he loved. He sat with that. He sat with all of it. In the conference room, with the documents in front of him and the photograph on the credenza and the east window full of the limestone face of a building he had been driving past for years without looking up. Would she have disappeared again? Without a word. Would she? The conference room held its particular quiet for a long time after she left. Marcus said Ethan's name once, carefully, in the manner of a man extending a handhold to someone standing at the edge of something steep. Ethan looked at him and shook his head, not in the direction of no, but in the direction of not yet. He looked at the acquisition documents on the table in front of him, and then at the framed photograph on the credenza, the one he had not looked at until today. And he thought about how many things stay invisible, not because they are hidden, but because the person who should be looking has aimed their attention somewhere less essential. He picked up his phone, sent one message to James. Clear Thursday and Friday. No meetings. He looked across the table. Marcus, he said, take Renata back to the office. I'll call you tonight. Marcus studied him with the expression of a man deciding how much latitude to extend to a decision he doesn't fully understand and doesn't quite have the right to contest. The transaction will be handled, Ethan said. Go. Dana was standing in the doorway when he pushed back his chair. She had the composed expression of a woman who has managed complicated situations for a long time and knows the precise shape of a man who has just understood something expensive. She'll be at the hotel until 8, Dana said, not volunteering, just placing it in the room, with the specific neutrality of someone who has been authorized to pass exactly this much information and nothing adjacent to it. Thank you, he said. He left. The hotel elevator carried him to the 14th floor, without any awareness on his part of the floors it passed through. He came out into a corridor quiet in the way of good hotels in the early evening. The particular, low-pitched silence of a building where people have arrived from the day and have not yet departed into the night. 1411. He stood outside the door for a moment that he could not have timed because he had stopped tracking time, and he raised his hand and knocked. The gap between the knock and the sound of movement inside was long enough that he thought twice about what he was doing there and who he was doing it as, and neither answer he arrived at was one he had prepared. The door opened. She was in different clothes than the conference room, a dark sweater, her hair loose in the way she had worn it in the apartment they had shared in the early years, before the apartment became the townhouse and the townhouse became the estate, and everything expanded into the shape his family's money required things to take. She had a due diligence file in one hand, which meant she had been working, which meant he was an interruption, which meant he had arrived without making sure she wanted him to. He had not called ahead. That was intentional, in the specific way of a man who understands that calling ahead gives the other person the ability to shape the arrival, and who has come without a shape on purpose, because he wanted her to see him the way he actually was, standing in a corridor above Midtown, with nothing prepared, and nothing managed, and nothing between him and what he had come to say. She looked at him. Ethan, she said, not a greeting and not a question. The word you say when you are buying the 2 seconds you need to decide what comes next. I know you're in the middle of something, he said. I know this is. He stopped, because the next word in that sentence was not one that covered what he meant. I need to ask you something, not about the transaction, not through attorneys, just you and me, and a question I should have asked 2 years ago. She held the door for a long moment, long enough that he understood it was real, not performance, not deliberate withholding, but a genuine pause from a woman who had built 18 months of careful architecture and was deciding, in real time, whether this was the door she wanted to open. She stepped back. He came in. The suite had the organized purposefulness he recognized from 8 years of watching her work in spaces she had made briefly hers. Files stacked in a specific sequence. A legal pad with precise notes in the handwriting he could read from across a room. A dinner setting for one. The food half finished and pushed to the side. The lights the way they get in rooms where someone has been working a long time without noticing the dark arriving. She did not offer him a seat. She set the file on the table and turned to look at him with the directness that was the most consistently true thing about her, in a life he had spent 8 years in and was only now beginning to understand the full outline of. Ask, she said. He stood where he was. Why did you leave without telling me what you found? The room was quiet in the specific way it gets when a question that has been in the air for a long time finally lands. She was quiet inside it, and her face had the quality he had seen once before, in the conference room, for less than a second, when he had said her name with something real in it. The quality of something beneath the composure that was not the composure, the actual face of it, the real thing. Because I was afraid, she said. He had not expected that word. In all the things he had prepared to hear tonight, afraid was not in the sequence, and its arrival rearranged the room around it. Of what? His voice was low. That you already knew. She did not look away from him. Her voice was even, and carrying it was visibly costing her something. And that cost was the most honest thing that had been in a room between them in years. The memo, Margaret's arrangement, what the marriage was designed to produce. She took a breath he could hear. I found it in Chicago and I sat with it for 3 hours. And by the end of those 3 hours, I had convinced myself that you must have been aware. That you couldn't have been in the same house as her for 40 years and not understood how she moved through the world. That if I confronted you, you'd confirm it. And she stopped, looked at him with the eyes of a woman saying something she has not said aloud before. I couldn't stay for the confirmation, so I left. He stood with that. He let it arrive fully, which was its own discipline for him. His instinct was always to respond before the thing finished landing, to move forward before he had been completely inside it. He made himself stay. You left, he said slowly, because you thought I was going to tell you. It was true, and you never asked. No, she said. I never asked. The silence that followed was the silence of two people who have just placed the actual shape of a mistake in the room between them. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, just the plain, exhausting, expensive shape of a thing that happened because neither of them had asked the right question at the right time, and both of them had excellent reasons for not asking that turned out, in the aggregate, to be insufficient. It wasn't true, he said. She looked at him. I didn't know about the memo. I didn't know what she arranged. He stopped, and he had the honesty, the specific, difficult honesty of a man who has spent a lifetime leading with certainty and is now saying something that doesn't fit that register. To continue. I knew there were things my mother did that I didn't examine. I let her manage things I should have looked at, because the dynamic was old, and I had been inside it so long I couldn't find its edges. That is not the same as knowing. But I understand why the distinction doesn't feel like it's worth much from where you were standing. She was quiet. I need you to hear me say that, he said. Not because it changes the 2 years, not because it resolves anything tonight, but because you carried this for 18 months thinking you knew the answer to a question you never asked, and the answer was wrong. And I am the person who should have made it impossible for you to be uncertain about what I was. She turned toward the window. Her hands were loose at her sides, and her shoulders had the set of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and is not yet certain how the putting down of it feels. He did not move toward her because she had not asked him to. That's not something you fix with a sentence, she said, to the window. I know. He kept his voice steady. I'm not trying to fix it with a sentence. I'm trying to start from what's actually true instead of the version we built inside our own heads. He looked at the line of her profile against the window and the dark city beyond it. I'm also going to do something. Not tonight. Tomorrow morning. With both our legal teams and the full board present and a recording running. She turned. I'm going to sit my mother in a room, he said, and I'm going to ask her to confirm, on record, what she did. Not because you need it. You have the memo, and you have always been protected, but because I need to be the person who asks, in front of everyone who should know. He looked at her directly, the look of a man who has made a decision that has no angle and no management, and no calculation beyond the one that makes it right. I should have done this 2 years ago. I didn't, because I didn't know, and because even if I had suspected, I would have found a way not to look at it directly. That's on me. This is what I can do now. She stood there for a long moment, measuring something he could not see the edges of. Then she walked back to the table and sat down in the chair nearest the window. Slowly, the way a person sits when they have been standing a long time. The transaction closes Thursday, she said. I know. I leave Friday. She said it without edge, without pressure. The way she said things she had already settled. That was always the plan. Finish the deal and go back to what I've been building. What I've built doesn't need to be in New York. He sat down across from her, not because she had offered it, because he was not leaving yet. Was that always the plan? He said. Close the deal. Let me sign. Disappear. The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. Yes, she said, quietly, without apology, because she was past the age of apologizing for protecting herself. I had no interest in a reunion. I had no interest in. She looked at the table. I didn't trust what it would do to me. To be in the same room with you again and see. She stopped. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were fixed on a point on the table. And Ethan had the disorienting experience of watching the composure not fail exactly, but allow something through it. The way a window allows light through without dissolving. I didn't trust what it would do to me to see that you had become someone worth coming back to. After I had already made peace with the leaving, the sentence arrived and sat in the room and did not ask permission. He sat very still. The way you sit when you have received something that took years to find its way to you, and you are not going to risk disturbing it. Vivian, he said, don't. Not sharp. Just the word of a woman who needs one more minute. He gave it to her. The meeting the following morning was called by Ethan and attended by his outside counsel, 3 of the Caldwell Group's senior board directors, and Vivian's legal team, whose lead attorney, Connor Mehta, arrived with a sealed copy of the memo in a document sleeve and set it on the conference table without being asked, because he had been doing this kind of work long enough to know what needed to be in the room before the conversation began. Margaret arrived last. She always arrived last. Timing was one of the instruments she had never once relinquished in 50 years of these rooms, because the person who controls the tempo of an entrance has already established something before a word has been spoken. She was in charcoal wool, precisely assembled, and she took the seat at the far end of the table and looked at the group assembled with the expressions of a woman who has been navigating situations like this for 4 decades and finds them, if not comfortable, then at least familiar. Then she looked at Ethan's face. Something reorganized below the surface of her stillness, not visible, because Margaret did not permit visible reorganization, but present in the specific quality of her composure, in the way a posture of control can modulate, almost imperceptibly, into a posture of preparation. What is this? She said, directed at him. The voice of a woman who already knows the answer is going to cost something, and is asking as a way of controlling the arrival of the cost. I think you know, he said. He had spoken to his mother in this manner in this room exactly once before in his life, and both of them knew that, and the knowing of it was itself a statement. Connor, Ethan said. Connor Mehta set the memo in front of Margaret. She looked at it. She looked at it for a measured moment, and her eyes moved across the first paragraph with the precise, contained expression of a woman reading something she has known for a long time would one day be on a table. This is a private family matter, she said, delivering the sentence with the full weight of 40 years of knowing exactly which phrase closed which room, handled within the family. You arranged the introduction to Vivian's father, Ethan said, not raised, not angry, because the anger had moved through him the night before and had been replaced by something steadier. You identified the Ashworth network as strategically valuable 3 years before I met her. You briefed the family attorney on the value of the match. I need you to say that, out loud, in this room. With this recording running, Margaret looked at him across the table with eyes that were clear and precise and entirely present. The eyes of a woman who has built a great many things and has arrived, perhaps for the first time, at one she cannot build her way out of. The cold that was in them was not cruelty and not malice. It was the cold of a person who is managed by the principle that everything can be managed. Encountering the limit of that principle, I acted in the interest of this family, she said. I'm not asking you to defend it, Ethan said. I'm asking you to confirm it. The pause that followed held the accumulated weight of a dynamic she had constructed from the first years of his life. She had built it piece by piece, with the patience and precision of someone who believed, at every stage, that she was doing the correct and necessary thing. She was not a simple villain. She was a woman who had loved her family in the only language she had been given, which was the language of arrangement and management and strategic protection, and who had used that language so long and so exclusively that she could no longer clearly locate the place where the love stopped and the control began. Yes, she said, precisely. with the composure of a woman selecting the last available thing she can control, which is the delivery of her own accountability. The match was strategically considered. Every significant decision I have made for this family has been strategically considered. I make no apology for that. You don't need to, Ethan said. Connor moved through the remaining documentation, the board conflict disclosure, the formal record, with the calm of a man who has done this specific kind of work before and has no interest in theater. Margaret signed where indicated. Her hand was steady throughout. Her hand had always been steady. It was one of the things Ethan had most admired in her, and had inherited, and was only now understanding the full cost of maintaining. When she set the pen down, she looked, for the first time, across the table at Vivian. Vivian met her gaze. She had been present through the full meeting and had said nothing, because she had not needed to say anything, because the documentation was on the table and the words were on the recording and the confirmation had been made in front of witnesses. And she had built this moment to speak for itself. What passed between the two women in that look was not warm and was not hostile. It was the unsentimentalized look of two people who have been on opposite sides of a genuine contest and have arrived, together, at the only honest conclusion available. They had both been trying to protect something real. The methods had cost more than either had planned for. That was simply what it had cost. And this room was where the accounting lived. Margaret stood. She straightened her jacket with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who will never permit a room to see her leave it as anything less than what she decided to be when she entered it. She looked at Ethan. "I'll have my attorney contact yours," she said, "about the board seat." "I know," he said. She walked to the door. She opened it and she walked through it, and she did not look back, which was also, in its way, a discipline she had maintained for 50 years, and which served her now as it had always served her, perfectly, at the cost of everything it cost. The door closed. The room sat with the sound of it for a moment. Then Connor gathered his documents, and the board directors looked at each other with the expressions of people who have witnessed something significant and are each deciding, privately, what it means for the institution they are responsible for. And Vivian picked up her pen and wrote one line in her legal pad, and the morning resumed. Damian Reeves' formal withdrawal arrived not as a phone call but as 2 lines in an email, sent at 11:47 to Ethan's personal address. Reeve Partners formally withdraws its acquisition bid on the Caldwell Group, effective immediately. No further approach is intended. And then, below it, because Reeve had never been able to resist the last word when he had earned the right to one. "She was right about you." Ethan showed it to Marcus, who read it twice, put his phone face down on the desk, and said, "Buy me lunch sometime." "Name the date," Ethan said. The VA capital acquisition closed on Thursday morning. 47 pages of final documentation, signed across 2 conference rooms in the Meridian building, with Dana's team and Ethan's, and 3 board directors present. The pension protection clause was confirmed, unchanged, exactly as it had been written by a person who had thought about the people it protected with a care that had no financial logic except the logic of believing those people mattered. The governance provisions were finalized. The company remained the company. Vivian signed as VA, Capital's principal. Ethan signed as CEO. They were in the same room for 4 hours and were professional and precise with each other. And once, over a disputed clause about capital reserve thresholds that occupied 40 minutes and required 3 drafts before the language was right, they argued, genuinely, substantively, each holding a position they believed was correct, and arrived at language that was better than either had originally proposed. Across the table, Marcus watched this with the expression of a man filing something away for later examination. When it was done, Vivian walked out. He let her go. She was leaving Friday, and he had said what he came to say at the hotel. And there is a specific kind of trust that cannot be constructed in a corridor or a conference room, that only accumulates through evidence and time. And he understood that now in a way he had not understood it for most of his life. He let her go. He went back to his office and did the work that was in front of him and did not call her, because he had finally, in the longest week of his recent years, learned the difference between patience and avoidance. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in December, he pressed the buzzer of an apartment building on Riverside Drive and gave his name to the intercom, and waited. The building was pre-war. The kind with high ceilings and the specific wooden-floored quiet of an apartment that has been lived in carefully for a long time. He had found the address through the Ashworth family office's public registration filings, which felt like an intrusion until he considered the alternative, which was not knowing, which he had been doing for 2 years, and was finished with. The door released. He took the elevator to the 7th floor. The door to 7C was already open when he reached it. She was standing in the frame in the dark sweater from the hotel, and her feet were bare on the wooden floor, and she was looking at him with an expression that had stopped trying to manage itself and was simply present, open and guarded at once. The way a door is both things when it is standing ajar and no one has yet decided which way it will go. "You came," she said. "You let me in," he said. She stepped back. He came inside. The apartment was hers in a way the suites and estates had never been. Small and precise and full of the actual evidence of the person who lived there. Books on every flat surface, organized by subject rather than by size. A framed print above the desk he recognized as the cover of her father's economics text, the one she had mentioned once in the early years and he had not followed up on, and which she had apparently never stopped thinking was worth putting on a wall. A window that looked out over the river, dark now in December, with the lights of the opposite shore arranged like a patient answers to the city behind them. She had been working. The dining table held her papers, her legal pad, a tea mug still releasing the faint motion of something recently poured. She did not apologize for any of it, because she was in her own space and because it was evidence of her life in motion and she had stopped in the last 2 years, excusing herself for that. He sat where she indicated, the chair by the window, for guests rather than for working alongside her, and looked at the river and then at her. "I don't have an agenda," he said. "I know." She sat on the edge of the sofa, not quite settled, not performing a comfort she hadn't yet decided she felt. "You don't show up without an agenda when you have one. I could always tell the difference." He looked at her. "Then you knew more about me than I let you know about yourself." "Yes," she said, not as accusation, as a fact that had cost something to hold. "You were more legible to me than you realized. That was part of what made the memo so hard. I knew you, and I couldn't make the two things fit, the man I knew and the thing on the page. And when they wouldn't fit, I decided the man I knew was the version I had constructed, and the page was what was real." "Instead of asking," he said. "Instead of asking," she said. The river moved outside the window, slow and dark, carrying whatever the city had given it, which was everything, always, without complaint. He looked at it. She looked at him looking at it. "I have something," she said. She stood, crossed to the bookshelf beside the desk, and opened the shallow drawer at its base. She took out a white envelope and came back and stood beside the coffee table and looked at it for a moment before she set it down between them. He looked at it, his handwriting. The tight, precise script he had carried since he was 12 and which had not changed significantly in the decades since. His handwriting, his hand on an envelope that had no address and no stamp, that had the particular condition of something carried with care for a long time. "I found it in the book I was reading when I packed," she said, still looking at the envelope rather than at him. "The one I took from the study. I don't know when you put it in there." She sat back down, her hands in her lap. "I've been carrying it for 2 years. I've held it probably 100 times. I've never opened it." He knew, immediately and with the strange doubling that very old memory produces, exactly when he had written it. First year of the marriage, a night in the apartment, before everything expanded into the shape the Caldwell name required things to take. Something had been sitting in him that he could not say aloud, had never been fully able to say aloud to her specifically, because the distance between what he felt and what he could produce in language had always been, with her specifically, wider than it was with anyone else, which was its own diagnostic that he had never had the clarity to read correctly. He had written it, put it in her book because he was a man who processed through paper and had not yet decided whether to give it to her. Then he had carried that decision unmade for 6 months, until she was gone and the decision had made itself. "I remember writing it," he said. His voice had the quality of something spoken from the room inside a person where things are stored that don't usually get brought out in front of other people. "I remember what it says, tell me." She said it simply, and then, because she was Vivian, and honesty was the thing she did not negotiate even when it cost her. "I've been waiting 2 years to hear what it says. I kept it because I couldn't throw it away, and I couldn't open it because I was afraid it was going to make everything harder. And I was already in the middle of building something I needed to be able to finish. He looked at her. She was looking at the envelope, and her hands were still, and she had the face of a woman who has set down something heavy she has been carrying a long time, and doesn't yet know whether it feels like relief or like exposure, or whether, as is usually the case, it is both at once. He picked up the envelope. He set it back down without opening it. It says, "I didn't know how to be in a room with you," he said. That I kept producing the version of myself I thought the marriage required, and that by the time I'd been producing it for 3 years, I couldn't find the edges of it anymore. That you were the one person I had never been able to manage. Because you saw through the management immediately and then looked at me as though you were willing to wait for whatever was underneath it. He looked at the table between them, at the envelope resting there, at the 2 mugs that didn't exist yet but would. It says I didn't know what to do with that. That I was afraid if I stopped performing, you would see how unfinished everything actually was, and that would end it. So I performed harder, and it ended anyway. The apartment held the silence, the way good rooms hold things, with a kind of respect for the weight of them. You wrote all of that, she said, and more, and put it in your book and didn't give it to you. He looked at her directly. I was an expert at the move that protected me from the outcome I was most afraid of, and the move always produced the outcome. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the envelope, and then she looked up at him with the eyes he had known and had not seen clearly for years. And they were the eyes of a woman who is doing something deliberate, not closing and not opening all the way, but making a specific choice about the amount of herself she is putting forward, which was its own kind of trust. "I was wrong about you," she said, "about what the marriage was, about what you knew. I built 18 months of something on top of being wrong, and it's—" She stopped. The breath she took was controlled and deliberate. "It's genuinely good work. I'm proud of it. And I built it out of the wrong material." "You built it from what you had," he said, "from what I gave you." She held his gaze. "We're not going to be able to sort out the accounting on this in one Tuesday evening." "No," he agreed, "we're not. And I'm not." She stopped again. In all the years he had known her, she had rarely stopped mid-sentence, because she did not begin sentences she didn't know how to finish. That she was stopping now told him that she was in territory she had not pre-mapped, which meant she was choosing it in real time, which meant it was real. "I'm not in a position to promise anything about what this is, about where it goes. I built a life in the last 2 years that is mine in a way I've never had a life that was mine, and I'm not prepared to." "I'm not asking you to promise anything," he said. "Vivian." He said her name in the way he had said it in the conference room, the way that had moved across her face before she could stop it. "I came because I want to start from what's actually true. Not to recover what we had, to find out what's here now." He looked at her steadily, with the look of a man who has stopped performing certainty and is simply being what he is. "That's the only thing I'm asking." The apartment was very still. She looked at him for a long moment, with the full attention she brought to things she was deciding about seriously. Not the professional assessment, but the human one. The question of whether the thing in front of her is real enough to risk the life she has built, to protect herself from the versions of this that weren't. She stood. She went to the kitchen. He heard the sound of a kettle filling with water, the specific domestic sound of something being prepared without ceremony, the sound of a person allowing an evening to continue rather than bringing it to its planned conclusion. He sat in the chair by the window and looked at the river in December. The lights on the far shore held their positions against the dark, with the patience of things that have been there a long time and are not auditioning for anyone's attention. Behind him, he could hear the kettle on its element, and the small quiet sounds of a kitchen being moved through by a person who knows where everything is. She came back, set 2 cups on the table, sat down on the sofa and pulled her feet up underneath her, the way she had always sat when a conversation was real rather than social. Barefoot, turned slightly toward the other person, the body language of a woman who has decided to be present rather than merely available. She picked up her tea. She looked at him across the cups and the envelope and the evening that was going to be whatever they made of it. "Tell me about the company," she said, not as a business question, as the beginning of a conversation between 2 people who have decided to start somewhere real and see where it leads. He told her. She listened the way she had always listened, with the full, unhurried attention of someone who treats listening as a practice rather than a courtesy. And the evening went on being an evening, in an apartment above the river, the December dark pressing its cold and patient face against the glass outside. The city doing what it always does on Tuesday nights, which is simply continue, indifferent and brilliant and full of stories it will never tell you. They sat, they talked. Neither of them reached for the envelope on the table, and neither of them forgot it was there. It was late before either of them noticed the hour, and when Vivian noticed, she did not say so. And when Ethan noticed, he did not reach for his coat. And those two decisions, made without discussion in the same moment, were their own kind of sentence. Not a promise and not a resolution and not the closing of the long, expensive account of everything they had spent and lost and carried. A beginning, a genuine one, with no performance in it, built from what was actually true rather than from what either of them had decided to believe without asking. Outside, the river moved south in the slow and permanent way of things that were moving long before anyone arrived to watch them and will continue long after. The lights held their positions on the far shore. The city went on being the city. Inside, on a Tuesday evening in December, two people drank their tea and talked in the particular register of people who have stopped pretending they know how the rest goes and are willing to find out. That was enough. That was, all things considered, considerably more than enough. That was, if you were paying attention, and both of them finally were, a start.